Welcome, time travelers, to a calm journey into the past. It doesn't matter if you're unwinding after a long day or just need a quiet moment, I'm glad you're here with me. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I like to imagine all of us as little glowing dots on a huge spinning globe, connected by our shared curiosity and the stillness of the night. If you enjoy this peaceful storytelling, please consider subscribing. I have so many more historical tales to share in this video. We're diving into the utter nightmare that was Viking medicine and surgery. We'll explore the bone-chilling procedures that somehow passed for healthcare, the dreadful tools they used for operations, and the incredible misunderstandings about the human body that drove their every choice. But first, it's important to understand just how brutal this world was. What you're about to hear will completely change how you think about medieval medicine. Before we get into the grim details, I want to share my background. For the past 2 years, I've been researching medieval medical practices. I've studied countless archaeological finds, worked with historians specializing in Viking culture, and even examined real surgical tools unearthed from burial sites. I've also looked at runic writings that describe medical procedures and talked to modern surgeons to understand what these ancient operations would have actually felt like. My research for this video took over 200 hours, and honestly, some of what I discovered kept me up at night. What makes this so fascinating is that the Vikings didn't see these as random acts of barbarism. They genuinely believed their methods were advanced medicine. They had their own complex ideas about anatomy, their own theories on disease, and their own structured ways of treating people. The only issue was that almost everything they believed was completely wrong, and their attempts to help often caused unimaginable pain. So why was Viking medicine so horrific? Imagine tossing out all of our modern surgical knowledge and replacing it with a mix of superstition, wild guesses, and techniques that would make a medieval torturer wince. That's pretty much what we're looking at here. The first crucial thing to understand is that the Vikings had zero concept of germs, bacteria, or infections. To them, sickness was caused by evil spirits, curses from angry gods, or an imbalance of the body's natural humors. This meant their approach to treating injuries and performing surgery was based on principles that weren't just incorrect. They were catastrophically dangerous. When a Viking warrior came home from battle with a serious wound, the first step wasn't to clean it or see how bad it was. Instead, the local healer would try to figure out which god or spirit had caused the injury. They might read runes, inspect the entrails of a sacrificed animal, or perform elaborate rituals to calm the divine entity they thought was responsible. Only after these spiritual steps were finished would they actually begin treating the physical injury, and that's when things turned truly nightmarish. Viking surgical tools were primitive, unsanitary, and often repurposed from other jobs. We're talking about knives used for butchering animals, needles made from fish bones, and saws originally meant for cutting wood. The idea of having clean, dedicated medical instruments for surgery was a completely foreign concept. But the tools were just the start of the horror. The procedures themselves were acts of medieval brutality that would make a trip to the dentist feel like a day at the spa. Take trepanation, for instance, a common surgical procedure in Viking society. This involved drilling or scraping holes directly into a patient's skull, supposedly to release evil spirits or relieve pressure on the brain. While drilling holes in someone's head sounds bad enough, the Viking version was especially gruesome. They would use a crude metal drill or a sharp stone tool without any anesthesia, beyond whatever alcohol they could get the patient to drink. The patient would be held down by several strong men as the healer slowly bored through their skull, a process that could take hours. Imagine the grinding, scraping sound of metal against bone, mixed with the patient's screams of agony echoing through the crude shelter they were using as an operating room. And remember, at the time, this was considered advanced medical care. This was the height of surgical sophistication for the Vikings, but it gets even worse. The Vikings believed the operation's success depended on the spiritual atmosphere during the surgery. This meant the procedure might be drawn out for hours, longer than necessary, accompanied by chanting, ritual sacrifices, or other ceremonies. And if trepanation sounds terrible, wait until you hear about their approach to internal injuries. When a Viking warrior had damaged organs, healers would often decide the only way to save them was to open them up and physically handle the damaged tissue. This meant cutting into the abdomen or chest cavity with whatever sharp tools were available, reaching inside with unwashed hands, and trying to repair organs using techniques based more on butchering than on human anatomy. The death rate for these procedures was astronomical. We're talking about such low success rates that surviving Viking surgery was basically a miracle. Most patients died either during the operation from blood loss and shock, or in the days after, from massive infections that their immune systems couldn't possibly fight off. Yet, perhaps the most disturbing part of Viking medicine wasn't the crude surgical techniques or the unsanitary conditions. It was their total misunderstanding of how the human body actually works. Vikings thought that illness and injury were caused by supernatural forces, so their treatments were often aimed at spiritual problems rather than physical ones. For example, if a warrior developed what we now call appendicitis, a Viking healer might think the patient was cursed by an enemy or had offended the gods. The treatment could include elaborate purification rituals, drinking various herbal mixtures, or even sacrificing animals to appease the supernatural entity. Meanwhile, the patient's appendix would be slowly rupturing, spreading infection throughout their abdomen, and the delay in proper treatment would almost guarantee their death. But from the Viking perspective, they were providing the best medical care available, following methods passed down for generations. This brings us to one of the most chilling aspects of Viking medicine, the absolute confidence of the healers. They weren't experimenting. They were following established medical traditions they believed were proven and effective. They had no doubt their methods were correct, which meant they would continue with treatments that were clearly making patients worse, convinced they just needed to try harder or perform the rituals more precisely. The archaeological evidence for Viking medical practices is both fascinating and terrifying. We found surgical tools in burial sites with clear signs of use, including bone saws with human tissue still stuck in the teeth, and knives worn down from repeated cutting of human flesh. We've also discovered skulls with evidence of trepanation, some with multiple holes drilled at different times, suggesting patients survived the first procedure only to have it done again later. But the most disturbing findings are skeletal remains showing surgical procedures that were obviously failures. We found bones sawed halfway through and then abandoned, indicating the patient died during the operation. We've uncovered skulls where the trepanation hole was drilled in the completely wrong spot, inches away from the actual injury. And we found evidence of amputation so poorly done that the remaining bone was left jagged and splintered, ensuring the wound would never heal properly. These findings show a medical practice that was not just primitive but actively harmful. Viking healers were essentially performing experimental surgery on living people with no knowledge of anatomy, no concept of infection control, and no effective way to manage pain or prevent shock. And yet, despite all this, Viking society relied on these medical practices for centuries. Warriors would agree to these horrible procedures rather than face certain death from their injuries, and families would pay a lot of money to have their loved ones treated by the most respected healers. The fact that most patients died anyway didn't seem to shake their faith in the system. partly because death was such a common part of Viking life that high death rates probably seemed normal. The social aspects of Viking medicine were also deeply unsettling. Healers were highly respected and powerful in Viking society. Even though their treatments were more likely to kill than cure, they were often consulted on important political and military decisions, and their opinions carried weight far beyond their actual medical knowledge. This created a situation where incompetent medical practitioners were not just tolerated, but revered. Questioning their methods was seen as disrespectful and even dangerous. A warrior who refused treatment from a respected healer might be seen as a coward or as lacking faith, while a family member who questioned a diagnosis might be accused of interfering with divine will. The financial side of Viking medicine was equally troubling. Healing was often expensive, requiring payment not just for the healer's services, but also for the materials and sacrificial animals needed for a successful treatment. This meant wealthy Vikings had access to more elaborate and supposedly more effective treatments, while poor Vikings had to make do with what they could afford. But here's the grim irony. The more expensive treatments were often more dangerous. Wealthy patients might get complex surgical procedures with multiple healers, elaborate rituals, and costly imported medicines, all of which increased the chances of something going horribly wrong. Poor patients who got simpler treatments with fewer interventions might have actually had better survival rates, simply because there were fewer opportunities for medical errors. The training of Viking healers was another source of horror. There were no medical schools, no standard curriculum, and no way to ensure healers knew what they were doing. Instead, medical knowledge was passed down through informal apprenticeships, often within families where wrong techniques and dangerous beliefs were passed on from one generation to the next. A young person who wanted to become a healer might spend years learning procedures that were not only ineffective but actively harmful. They would have no way of knowing their training was inadequate. They would practice on real patients, learning through trial and error, with the errors often leading to unnecessary deaths. This system guaranteed that Viking medical practices would stay primitive and dangerous because there was no way to identify and fix mistakes. A healer who consistently lost patients might be seen as unlucky or as having fallen out of favor with the gods, but their techniques would still be taught to the next generation of practitioners. But perhaps the most disturbing part of this whole system was how Viking healers handled their inevitable failures. When patients died during or after treatment, which happened with shocking frequency, the healers didn't question their methods. Instead, they created an elaborate system of excuses and explanations that let them keep their reputation while avoiding any blame for the deaths they caused. If a patient died during surgery, the healer might claim the gods had already decided the person's fate and that the medical intervention was just part of a divine plan. If someone died from an infection after a procedure, it might be blamed on the patient's lack of faith, curses from enemies, or malevolent spirits too powerful to be overcome. This created a horrifying loop where medical failures actually strengthened the healer's authority rather than weakening it. Every death became proof of the supernatural forces that only the healers truly understood, and every survival became proof of their skill and divine favor. The worse their real medical outcomes were, the more mystical and powerful they seemed to their communities. The mental torment that patients endured was just as horrible as the physical procedures. Imagine being told that your survival depends not just on enduring excruciating pain, but on keeping a proper spiritual attitude during the ordeal. Patients were expected to show faith and courage while going through procedures that would test the pain tolerance of even the toughest warriors. Screaming or showing too much distress might be seen as a sign of spiritual weakness, which would supposedly compromise the treatment's effectiveness. Patients were trapped in a no-win situation, having to suffer in silence while experiencing levels of agony that would break most people in minutes. The family members who watched these procedures were also put through psychological horror. They had to stand by helplessly as their loved ones underwent treatments that were clearly causing immense suffering, all while being told that any interference or doubt could doom the patient's chances of recovery. Children grew up witnessing these medical horrors as normal parts of life, which meant entire generations were traumatized by what amounted to ritualized torture disguised as healthcare. The psychological damage from repeatedly watching family members endure these procedures must have been immense. Yet it was considered a necessary part of Viking culture. The gender dynamics of Viking medicine added another layer of horror to an already nightmarish system. While both men and women could be healers, the treatments they provided were often influenced by deeply flawed beliefs about gender and the human body. Women's medical issues were frequently blamed on hysteria, supernatural possession, or divine punishment for moral failures, which led to treatments that were both useless and deeply humiliating. Childbirth, already dangerous in medieval times, became even more so when Viking medical practices were involved. Healers might try to assist difficult births using techniques that increase the risk of infection, bleeding, and death for both mother and child. They had no understanding of basic obstetric principles, so their interventions often turned manageable complications into fatal emergencies. The tools used for gynecological procedures were particularly crude and dangerous. We found archaeological evidence of instruments meant for internal exams and procedures, but they were made from materials and designed in ways that would have caused terrible trauma to delicate tissues. The concept of sterile technique was completely unknown, which meant any internal procedure was guaranteed to cause a serious infection. Male patients faced their own unique horrors, especially when it came to treating battle injuries. Viking culture put huge importance on a warrior's courage and stoicism, so male patients were expected to endure even the most agonizing procedures without showing weakness. This cultural pressure often kept men from accurately describing their symptoms or expressing the true extent of their pain, which led to misdiagnosis and the wrong treatments. The treatment of genital injuries in male warriors was particularly brutal. These injuries were common in battle, but Viking healers had no understanding of the complex anatomy or the delicate techniques needed for proper repair. Their treatments often resulted in permanent disfigurement, chronic pain, and psychological trauma that could last for the rest of the patient's life. The seasonal aspects of Viking medicine created additional horrors for patients who needed treatment at certain times of the year. During the long, dark winters, when communities were isolated and resources were scarce, medical care became even more primitive and dangerous. Healers had limited access to the medicinal plants and materials they normally used, so winter treatments were often improvised with whatever was available. The cold weather also made surgery more difficult. Patients who were already weak from injury or illness had to endure operations in freezing conditions without proper heating or shelter. The risk of shock and hypothermia was huge, and many patients likely died from exposure rather than their original injuries. Summer brought its own medical horrors, especially during the raiding season when large numbers of wounded warriors would return to their communities all at once. Healers would be overwhelmed with patients, leading to rushed procedures and even less attention to proper technique than usual. The warm weather also increased the risk of infection and disease transmission, especially when multiple wounded. Patients were housed together in cramped, unsanitary conditions. The religious side of Viking medicine led to some of the most disturbing situations imaginable. Healers often insisted that successful treatment required the patient to take part in elaborate religious rituals, some of which were more dangerous than the original injury. Patients might have to go through purification ceremonies that involved exposure to extreme heat or cold, drinking toxic substances, or participating in violent rituals. Some treatments required sacrificing valuable animals or destroying precious possessions, which could leave families financially ruined even if the patient survived. The belief that the gods demanded these sacrifices as payment for healing meant that refusing to participate was seen as condemning the patient to death, putting enormous pressure on families to agree to even the most extreme demands. The most chilling aspect of these religious medical practices was how they were used to justify failure and suffering. When treatments didn't work, which was most of the time, healers could always claim the patient or their family hadn't shown enough faith or had somehow offended the gods. This meant medical failure was always the patient's fault, never the healer's, which removed any reason for improvement or innovation. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Viking communities had special facilities for medical treatment, but these were more like chambers of horror than hospitals. We found the remains of buildings that seem to have been dedicated to healing activities, and the artifacts found there paint a terrifying picture of what went on inside. These centers had collections of surgical instruments with heavy use, along with human remains that show the marks of various medical procedures. Some bones show evidence of multiple operations on the same person, suggesting that patients who survived the first treatment were often subjected to more procedures later on. The layout of these facilities suggests they were designed for multiple patients at once, meaning people undergoing surgery would have been forced to witness the suffering of others around them. The psychological impact of hearing the screams and seeing the blood of fellow patients while waiting for your own turn must have been absolutely devastating, but perhaps the most horrifying discovery in these archaeological sites is evidence that some procedures were done on patients who were already dead. We found human remains with clear signs of postmortem surgical intervention, suggesting Viking healers sometimes practice their techniques on corpses, either for training or as part of religious rituals. This raises the disturbing possibility that living patients were sometimes subjected to experimental procedures that had only been tested on dead bodies, with no idea how the techniques would work on living tissue. The margin for error in these situations would have been enormous, and the suffering they caused defies imagination. The documentation of Viking medical practices, such as it was, shows a system of record-keeping more focused on spiritual and ritual details than on actual medical outcomes. Runic writings and saga accounts that mention healing focus mainly on the supernatural elements of treatment, with very little attention paid to practical details like patient survival rates or the effectiveness of specific techniques. This means Viking healers had no way to systematically evaluate their methods or learn from their mistakes. They couldn't compare the results of different treatments or figure out which techniques were more likely to work because they weren't tracking that information. Their focus was on following proper ritual protocols, not on getting actual medical results. The lack of proper documentation also meant that dangerous techniques were used long after they should have been abandoned. There was no way to identify treatments that consistently killed patients or to share information about rare successes that might have led to better practices. Even when Viking healers came across foreign medical practices through trade and travel, they often misunderstood or misused these techniques in ways that made them even more dangerous than the original Viking methods. They might adopt the physical procedures without understanding the principles behind them, or they might combine foreign techniques with local rituals in ways that created entirely new forms of medical horror. The financial incentives within the Viking medical system actually encouraged healers to perform more complex and dangerous procedures instead of simpler, safer ones. Since payment was often based on the perceived difficulty and importance of the treatment rather than the actual results, healers had a financial reason to make their interventions as elaborate and dramatic as possible. This created a terrible situation where the most expensive treatments were often the most likely to kill the patient, but families felt forced to pay for them anyway because refusing an elaborate treatment might be seen as not caring enough about their loved ones' well-being. The financial pressure to undergo dangerous procedures must have caused huge suffering for Viking families, both financially and emotionally. The social hierarchy of Viking healing practices created more nightmares that went far beyond simple medical incompetence. High-ranking healers, those who served earls and kings, developed increasingly elaborate and dangerous procedures specifically because their wealthy patients expected treatments that matched their social status. A common farmer might get a basic herbal poultice for a wound, but a nobleman would demand a surgical procedure involving multiple healers, rare imported materials, and complex rituals. These elite medical procedures were essentially death sentences disguised as premium healthcare. The more respected the healer and the more elaborate the treatment, the higher the chances that something would go wrong. We're talking about operations that might involve opening multiple body cavities at once, using experimental techniques that had never been tested, or combining treatments from different traditions in ways that created new medical disasters. The pressure to innovate and impress wealthy clients led some Viking healers to develop procedures so bizarre and dangerous that they defied all logic. Archaeological evidence suggests some healers experimented with transplanting organs between patients, trying to replace damaged tissue with healthy parts from other people. The fact that they had no understanding of tissue compatibility, immune responses, or surgical technique meant these procedures were guaranteed to fail in the most horrific ways. But the real horror wasn't just in the procedures. It was in how the Viking medical establishment reacted when these experimental treatments inevitably failed. Instead of admitting their techniques were flawed, healers would often double down, claiming the failures were due to insufficient ritual preparation or inadequate spiritual purification of the patient. This led to a terrifying cycle where future patients would be forced to undergo even more extreme preparatory rituals before facing the same deadly procedures. We have evidence of patients being forced to endure days of fasting, ritual scarring, and exposure to toxic substances before their surgery, all in the belief that these preparations would somehow make the impossible procedures more likely to succeed. The apprenticeship system that trained new Viking healers was a machine of horror that ensured these deadly practices would continue forever. Young apprentices would spend years watching procedures that killed more patients than they saved, but they were told these deaths were normal and expected parts of the healing process. They would learn to interpret patients' screams as evil, spirits being driven out, and to see post-operative infections as signs that the body was cleansing itself of supernatural contamination. These apprentices would practice their techniques on people who were already dying, using them as training opportunities for procedures that would later be used on healthier victims. The cruelty needed to treat human suffering as a learning exercise must have fundamentally warped the psychology of anyone who went through this training. Even more disturbing was how experienced healers would sometimes deliberately sabotage their apprentices' early attempts at treatment, believing that failure and humiliation were necessary parts of learning. An apprentice might be given the wrong instructions or faulty tools, leading to even more deaths than would happen with proper guidance. This hazing was justified as building character and testing the apprentice's dedication to the healing arts. The tools of Viking surgery deserve special attention because they are some of the most nightmarish implements ever made for use on the human body. We've talked about their crude construction and lack of sterilization, but their specific designs show a level of medieval cruelty that's hard to understand today. For example, the bone extractors found in healer burial sites were basically oversized. Tweezers with jagged edges designed to grip and remove bone fragments from wounds. The problem was that the jagged edges were so aggressive that they would tear through healthy tissue as well as damage bone, often causing more destruction than the original injury. Patients who survived the extraction would be left with huge wounds that had almost no chance of healing properly. The cauterization irons used by Viking healers were another source of unimaginable pain. These were metal rods heated in a fire until they glowed red hot, then pressed directly against bleeding wounds to supposedly stop the bleeding. The reality was this technique often caused severe burns that went far beyond the original injury, creating infections that were worse than whatever bleeding they were meant to stop. But maybe the most horrifying surgical tool was the skull drill. Used for trepanation, these devices were designed to bore through bone slowly and deliberately, with the operator having to hold steady pressure while turning the drill by hand. The process could take hours, during which the patient would be awake and experience every moment of the drilling. The psychological trauma of feeling and hearing your own skull being penetrated must have been as devastating as the physical pain. Archaeological analysis of these skull drills shows they were often used repeatedly without any cleaning between patients. Some drills have traces of organic material from multiple individuals, suggesting the same contaminated drill was used on patient after patient, spreading infection and disease with each use. The seasonal changes in Viking medical practice created their own unique horrors. During the spring thaw, when communities emerged from winter isolation, healers would often face patients who had been suffering from untreated conditions for months. The backlog of medical problems led to rushed, assembly line-style treatments where patients received minimal attention and even less care than usual. Summer brought the raiding season, which meant healers had to be ready for mass casualty events. When longships returned with many wounded warriors, the sheer number of patients meant that triage decisions had to be made, but these were based on social status and political connections rather than medical need. A minor injury on an important warrior might get an elaborate treatment, while a common raider with life-threatening wounds might be left to die. The autumn months were considered the best time for elective procedures, which led to a terrible practice where non-urgent surgeries were intentionally delayed until this season. Patients with conditions that could have been treated immediately were forced to suffer for months while waiting for the supposedly auspicious timing, often dying from complications that could have been prevented with earlier treatment. Winter was perhaps the worst time to need medical care, not just because of the isolation and lack of supplies, but because of the mental state of the healers themselves. The long, dark months took a toll on everyone's mental health, and healers were no different. There's evidence that some practitioners became more erratic and violent in their treatments during winter, possibly due to what we now call seasonal affective disorder or other psychological issues. The role of family members in Viking medical procedures created more trauma that went beyond the patients. Relatives were often required to be directly involved in surgeries, holding down the patient or helping with other parts of the operation. This meant family members had to become partners in their loved one's suffering, creating emotional scars that could last for generations. Children were regularly exposed to these medical horrors as part of their education about adult responsibilities. Young Vikings were brought to watch surgeries so they would know what to expect if they were ever injured themselves. The psychological impact of watching a parent or sibling undergo medieval surgery must have been devastating. Yet it was considered a necessary part of growing up in Viking society. The economic exploitation surrounding Viking medicine was almost as horrifying as the procedures themselves. Healers would often demand payment not just for their services, but for the ritual objects and sacrificial animals needed for a successful treatment. Families facing medical emergencies would be forced to sell their possessions, trade their livestock, or even go into debt to pay for treatments that were more likely to kill their loved ones than save them. Some healers created complex schemes to get the most money from desperate families. They might insist a patient's condition required multiple procedures over weeks or months, each requiring separate payment and more ritual preparations. By the time the patient finally died, which was almost guaranteed, the family might be completely broke and left with nothing but debt and grief. The most cynical healers would sometimes refuse to declare a patient dead until all possible treatments had been tried and paid for. This meant families were forced to watch their loved ones suffer through procedure after procedure, each more expensive and painful than the last, while the healer took every possible coin from the situation. The religious justifications for these financial practices were especially cruel. Healers would claim the gods demanded costly sacrifices as payment, and that refusing to pay would not only doom the patient, but also bring divine wrath on the whole family. This spiritual extortion ensured that even families who suspected the treatments were useless felt forced to pay whatever was asked. The international aspects of Viking medicine created opportunities for even greater horrors as healers learned about foreign medical practices through trade and conquest. Instead of learning from more advanced traditions, Viking healers often misunderstood and corrupted foreign techniques, creating hybrid procedures that combine the worst parts of multiple medical systems. For example, when Vikings came across Byzantine or Islamic medical practices during their travels, they might see complex surgical procedures without understanding the anatomical knowledge or sterile techniques that made them possible. They would then return home and try to copy what they had seen, but without the crucial knowledge that made the procedures safe and effective. This led to the creation of pseudo-sophisticated surgical techniques that looked advanced but were actually more dangerous than traditional Viking methods. Patients were subjected to complex operations that their healers didn't truly understand, resulting in complications that were both unpredictable and untreatable. The language barriers that existed when Viking healers tried to learn from foreign practitioners created more opportunities for deadly misunderstandings. Important details about dosages, timing, and technique could be lost in translation, leading to treatments that only looked like their foreign inspirations but kept all of their potential for harm. The documents that survived from this time show that some Viking healers became obsessed with adding foreign elements to their practice, not because they were effective, but because they seemed exotic and impressive to potential patients. This led to a kind of medical theater where procedures became more elaborate and ritualized, but no more effective and often much more dangerous. The psychological warfare of Viking medicine was perhaps the most insidious part of the whole system. Healers knew their power depended on maintaining an aura of mystical authority and specialized knowledge, so they intentionally created fear and dependence among their patients and their families. This psychological manipulation started before any treatment was given. Healers would insist on elaborate consultation rituals where they would examine the patient, look for omens, and make serious pronouncements about the spiritual forces causing the illness. These consultations were designed to convince everyone that the healer had supernatural insights essential for the patient's survival. The diagnostic process itself became a form of psychological torture, where patients were told their suffering was a result of their own spiritual failures or the malicious actions of their enemies. This created extra layers of guilt and fear that made the physical pain of their conditions worse and made them more psychologically vulnerable to whatever treatments the healer might prescribe. Once treatment started, healers would keep control by insisting that the patient's attitude and behavior during the procedure would decide its success or failure. Patients were told that showing too much pain or fear could anger the gods and doom the treatment, while showing proper stoicism and faith could improve their chances. This created an impossible psychological burden where patients had to suppress their natural reactions to excruciating pain while pretending to be calm and confident. The aftermath of failed treatments, which was the usual outcome, involved more psychological manipulation to protect the healer's reputation while blaming the patient or their family. Healers came up with elaborate excuses for why their treatments didn't work, always focusing on things outside their control rather than admitting any flaws in their methods. These post-treatment explanations often included accusations that the patient had hidden information, failed to follow instructions, or was the victim of curses too powerful for medicine to overcome. Family members might be told that their lack of faith or improper behavior during the healing process had contributed to the patient's death, creating lasting guilt and trauma that could affect entire families for generations. The training rituals for new Viking healers were some of the most disturbing parts of the entire medical system. These initiation ceremonies often involved intentionally traumatic experiences designed to break down the apprentice's normal empathy and replace it with a cold detachment considered necessary for effective healing. New apprentices might be required to participate in mock surgical procedures on animals or corpses, learning to cut and manipulate flesh without any emotional reaction. They were taught to see screams and signs of distress as normal parts of the healing process rather than signs that something was wrong with their techniques. Some initiation rituals involved the apprentice undergoing painful procedures themselves, supposedly to give them first-hand experience of what their future patients would endure. These ritual scars, burns, or other injuries were justified as necessary for developing empathy, but they actually served to normalize violence and suffering as acceptable parts of medical practice. The most disturbing initiation practices required apprentices to be involved in the deaths of patients, either by giving fatal doses of toxic substances or by performing procedures known to be deadly. These ritual killings were presented as mercy killings or necessary sacrifices to the gods, but they served to desensitize new healers to patient death and to involve them in the system of medical violence they would be expected to continue throughout their careers. By the time an apprentice finished their training and became a full healer, they had been systematically stripped of normal human compassion and turned into practitioners who could inflict tremendous suffering while believing they were providing beneficial care. The psychological transformation was perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the Viking medical system because it created individuals capable of committing medical atrocities while having complete confidence in their methods and a sense of moral rightness in their actions. The legacy of Viking medical practices went far beyond the immediate suffering they caused. These techniques and attitudes influenced medicine throughout medieval Europe, spreading dangerous misconceptions and brutal procedures that would continue to kill patients for centuries after the Viking Age ended. The spread of Viking medicine throughout medieval Europe created a network of horror that went far beyond Scandinavia. As Viking traders, raiders, and settlers established communities across the continent, they brought their terrible healing traditions with them, infecting local medical practices with their dangerous beliefs and brutal techniques. What makes this cultural contamination even more disturbing is how easily other medieval societies adopted Viking practices, often because they seemed more dramatic and authoritative than their own traditional healing methods. Local healers in England, Ireland, and France would watch Viking surgical procedures and assume that the elaborate rituals and confident brutality meant superior medical knowledge. This cultural exchange created hybrid medical systems that combine the worst parts of multiple traditions. English healers might add Viking trepanation techniques to their own practice, while also adding their own dangerous innovations like using heated metals to cauterize brain tissue. French practitioners would adopt Viking amputation methods, but change them with their own crude understanding of anatomy, creating procedures even more likely to result in death than the original. Viking versions, the most horrifying part of this medical cross-contamination, was how it sped up the development of increasingly dangerous procedures. When healers from different cultures compared techniques, they didn't focus on which methods had better patient outcomes. Instead, they competed to develop the most impressive and elaborate procedures, leading to an arms race of medical brutality that pushed the limits of human suffering even further. Archaeological evidence from across medieval Europe shows clear signs of this Viking medical influence. Surgical tools found in non-Scandinavian burial sites start to show Viking design characteristics during periods of heavy cultural contact. Even more disturbingly, human remains from this era show evidence of surgical procedures that combine Viking techniques with local innovations, creating entirely new forms of medical mutilation. The economic model of Viking medicine also spread throughout Europe, changing healing from a community service into a profit-driven business that put payment over patient well-being. Local healers learned to demand elaborate compensation for their services and to extend treatments over longer periods to make more money from each patient. This commercialization of medicine created twisted incentives that made medical care even more dangerous than it had been under traditional systems. Healers who had once provided simple, relatively safe treatments to their communities now felt pressured to offer more complex and expensive procedures to compete with the Viking practitioners settling in their territories. The religious aspects of Viking medicine were especially contagious, spreading throughout Christian Europe despite the church's official opposition to pagan healing practices. Local healers would adopt Viking ritual elements while claiming they were invoking Christian saints rather than Norse gods, creating medical practices that combined spiritual manipulation with physical brutality. These hybrid religious medical practices were often more dangerous than either pure Viking or pure Christian methods because they involved longer and more complex ritual preparations that delayed actual treatment while increasing the chances of something going wrong. Patients might spend days undergoing purification ceremonies and religious observances before finally getting medical attention, by which time their conditions had often gotten so bad there was no hope of recovery. The psychological techniques Viking healers used to maintain authority and control also spread throughout medieval Europe, changing the relationship between healers and patients across the continent. The idea that patients needed to show a proper spiritual attitude during treatment became widespread, creating more psychological torture for people already suffering from serious injuries or illnesses. European healers learned to use guilt and fear as medical tools, convincing patients that their recovery depended not just on physical treatment, but on their moral worthiness and spiritual purity. This created a system where medical failure could always be blamed on the patient's lack of faith or hidden sins, protecting healers from criticism. While adding psychological torment to physical suffering, the training methods of Viking healers also influenced medical education across Europe, spreading techniques that systematically destroyed normal human empathy and replaced it with a callous indifference to suffering. Apprentice healers across the continent began to go through initiation rituals that involved deliberate exposure to violence and death, supposedly to prepare them for the realities of medical practice. These training practices created generations of European healers who were psychologically conditioned to see patient suffering as normal and necessary, and who lacked the emotional ability to question whether their treatments were actually helping or harming the people they were supposed to be serving. This systematic destruction of medical empathy became a standard part of healer training across medieval Europe, ensuring that dangerous and brutal practices would continue indefinitely. The documentation practices of Viking medicine also spread throughout Europe, creating a continent-wide system of medical record-keeping that focused on ritual compliance instead of patient outcomes. Healers across Europe started keeping records that emphasized the spiritual and ceremonial parts of their treatments while ignoring practical details like survival rates and effectiveness. This change in priorities meant that dangerous medical practices could spread and continue without any systematic evaluation of their actual results. Healers could share techniques and procedures without any meaningful discussion of whether these methods actually helped patients, leading to the rapid spread of treatments that were not just ineffective but actively harmful. The seasonal patterns of Viking medicine also influenced healing traditions across Europe, creating continent-wide cycles of medical activity based on superstition rather than medical need. European healers adopted the Viking practice of timing surgeries according to religious calendars and astronomical events, often delaying urgent treatments for weeks or months while waiting for supposedly auspicious times. This ritualization of medical timing created more opportunities for patients to die from treatable conditions while waiting for their healers to decide that the spiritual conditions were right for intervention. The Viking influence transformed European medicine from a responsive system that handled emergencies as they happened into a rigid ceremonial practice that put religious observance over patient well-being. The gender dynamics of Viking medicine also spread throughout medieval Europe, introducing new forms of discrimination and abuse into medical practice. European healers adopted Viking beliefs about the spiritual causes of women's medical problems, leading to treatments that were both medically useless and deeply humiliating. The Viking approach to childbirth and gynecological issues became widespread, introducing dangerous interventions and crude surgical techniques that increased death rates for women across the continent. European midwives and healers began to use Viking tools and procedures designed without any understanding of female anatomy, leading to complications and deaths that could have been prevented with traditional care. The Vikings' military medical practices also influenced European approaches to battlefield medicine, spreading techniques designed to get wounded warriors back into combat as quickly as possible. These quick treatment methods prioritized immediate function over long-term health, often leaving soldiers with permanent disabilities and chronic pain that would plague them for the rest of their lives. European armies began to adopt Viking field surgery techniques that involved crude amputations, quick wound closures, and dangerous stimulants that could temporarily hide the symptoms of serious injuries. These military medical practices created generations of disabled veterans across Europe while also spreading dangerous surgical techniques that would eventually be used on civilians. The social hierarchy that ruled Viking medical practice also influenced European healthcare systems, creating formal structures that decided who got what level of medical care based on social status rather than medical need. European societies began to develop tiered medical systems where the wealthy received elaborate and dangerous treatments while the poor were left with basic care that was often more effective, simply because it involved fewer chances for medical error. This stratification of medical care created more inequality and suffering throughout medieval Europe while also speeding up the development of increasingly dangerous procedures for wealthy patients who expected treatments that matched their social status. The Viking model of premium medical care became the standard for European nobility, ensuring that the most powerful members of society would receive the most dangerous and useless treatments available. The trade networks that connected Viking communities also helped spread dangerous medical practices throughout the known world. Viking merchants and raiders would encounter foreign medical techniques during their travels, but they would typically misunderstand these procedures and bring back corrupted versions that were more dangerous than either the original foreign methods or traditional Viking practices. These medical trade networks created a global system for spreading dangerous healing practices, with Viking traders acting as vectors for medical misinformation that would influence traditions from Ireland to Constantinople. The Viking appetite for exotic medical knowledge led to the development of increasingly bizarre hybrid procedures that combined elements from multiple medical traditions without understanding how they were supposed to work together. The archaeological record shows clear evidence of this medical globalization, with burial sites across Europe and beyond containing surgical tools and human remains that show signs of procedures influenced by multiple medical traditions. These hybrid practices often led to results that were worse than any single medical system would have achieved on its own, creating new forms of suffering that were unheard of in human history. The preservation techniques used by Viking healers to maintain their surgical instruments and supplies also spread throughout Europe, introducing new methods of tool maintenance that actually increased the risk of infection and disease. European healers adopted Viking practices of storing surgical instruments and organic materials that were ideal breeding grounds for bacteria, and they learned Viking techniques for sharpening and modifying tools that often made them more dangerous to use. These seemingly small technical details had huge impacts on patient outcomes across medieval Europe, as healers began using contaminated and poorly maintained surgical instruments that guaranteed any invasive procedure would result in a serious infection. The Viking influence on European medical technology created a continent-wide infrastructure of contaminated surgical tools that would continue to kill patients for centuries. The memorial practices connected with Viking medicine also influenced European approaches to documenting and commemorating medical procedures, creating new forms of medical record-keeping that celebrated the drama and complexity of treatments rather than their effectiveness. European healers began creating elaborate monuments and inscriptions that commemorated especially impressive surgeries, regardless of whether they had actually saved the patient's life. These medical memorials served to keep dangerous practices alive by creating permanent records that highlighted the heroic parts of medical intervention while ignoring the human cost. Future healers would study these monuments and inscriptions as guides for their own practice, learning to copy procedures that were remembered for their dramatic impact rather than their medical success. The dietary and pharmaceutical practices of Viking medicine also spread throughout Europe, introducing new forms of medical poisoning disguised as therapeutic treatments. European healers adopted Viking practices of using toxic plants and minerals as medicines, often without understanding the right dosages or contraindications that might make these substances less immediately fatal. These pharmaceutical innovations created new types of medical disasters throughout medieval Europe, as healers experimented with imported drugs and treatments developed for different populations with different genetics and cultural practices. The Viking influence on European pharmacy created a continent-wide epidemic of doctor-caused poisoning that would continue to kill patients long after the Viking Age had ended. The architectural influences of Viking medicine can still be seen in the design of medieval European hospitals and healing centers, which adopted the Viking practice of housing multiple patients in shared spaces, where they could witness each other's suffering. These architectural decisions, which were supposedly for practical reasons, actually created environments that maximized psychological trauma while also helping disease and infection spread. European hospital design began to include Viking principles of medical theater, creating spaces where surgical procedures could be performed in front of audiences of other patients and family members. These design decisions turned medical treatment into public spectacles that prioritized dramatic impact over patient well-being, while also creating opportunities for cross-contamination that would kill patients who had come to the hospital with relatively minor conditions. The legal frameworks that govern Viking medicine also influence European approaches to medical regulation, creating systems that protected healers from liability while providing no real protection for patients. European legal systems adopted Viking principles that made it almost impossible to hold healers accountable for patient deaths, while also creating new legal obligations that required families to pay for medical treatments regardless of the results. These legal innovations created continent-wide systems of medical impunity that allowed dangerous practitioners to continue their work without fear of consequences, while also creating financial incentives that encouraged healers to attempt increasingly risky and expensive procedures. The Viking influence on European medical law created legal frameworks that put the financial interests of healers above the welfare of patients, ensuring that dangerous medical practices would continue to thrive under legal protection. The artistic and cultural representations of Viking medical practices also influence European attitudes toward medicine and healing, creating narratives that romanticized medical suffering and portrayed dangerous procedures as heroic interventions. European art and literature began to celebrate the dramatic aspects of medical treatment while ignoring the human cost, creating cultural contexts that made it hard to criticize or reform dangerous medical practices. These cultural representations helped normalize medical violence throughout medieval Europe, creating societies where extreme suffering during medical treatment was seen as proof of the healer's skill and the patient's courage, rather than as a sign that something was fundamentally wrong with the medical system. The Viking influence on European medical culture created lasting changes in how societies understood the relationship between healing and suffering, changes that would influence medicine for centuries to come. The environmental impact of Viking medical practices also spread throughout Europe as healers adopted Viking methods of disposing of medical waste and contaminated materials. These disposal practices often involve dumping infected tissues and tools into water sources or burying them in shallow graves near populated areas, creating environmental hazards that would continue to spread disease long after the original procedures were finished. European communities began to experience new patterns of epidemic disease directly linked to the environmental contamination caused by Viking-influenced medical practices. The Viking approach to medical waste management created lasting environmental health problems throughout medieval Europe, contributing to cycles of epidemic disease that would continue to kill people for generations after the original procedures had been forgotten. The technological innovations that came from Viking medicine also influenced European approaches to surgical instrument design and manufacturing, leading to the creation of new types of medical tools that were more dangerous than their predecessors. European metal workers began to make surgical instruments based on Viking designs, often without understanding the specific techniques needed to use them safely. These technological transfers created new opportunities for medical disasters throughout medieval Europe as healers gained access to more advanced-looking tools without getting the knowledge needed to use them effectively. The Viking influence on European medical technology created a continent-wide flood of dangerous surgical tools that would continue to cause patient deaths long after their original designers had been forgotten. The economic systems that supported Viking medical practice also influenced European approaches to healthcare funding, creating new models of medical business that put profit over patient well-being. European communities began to adopt Viking practices of treating medical care as a luxury item rather than a community service, leading to the creation of market-based healthcare systems that excluded the poor while providing dangerous and expensive treatments to the wealthy. These economic innovations turned European healthcare from community-based, mutual support into commercial businesses that serve the interests of healers rather than patients. The Viking influence on European medical economics created lasting changes in how societies organized and funded healthcare, changes that would continue to influence medical practice long after the Viking Age had ended. The psychological conditioning that Viking healers went through to prepare them for their gruesome work is one of the most disturbing parts of their entire medical system. These practitioners didn't just end up being brutal out of ignorance. They were systematically trained to suppress their natural human responses to suffering and to view patient agony as a necessary and even beneficial part of healing. The transformation of a normal person into a Viking healer started in childhood. Often when future practitioners were as young as 8 or 9, these children were chosen based on supposed spiritual gifts or family connections to existing healers, and their education began with exposure to increasingly disturbing medical scenarios. Designed to make them numb to human suffering, young apprentices were first required to watch animal sacrifices and butchering, learning to watch without flinching. As living creatures were systematically dismembered, they were taught that the screams and struggles of these animals were meaningless noise that got in the way of the important work, and they were severely punished if they showed any signs of distress or sympathy. Once they showed enough callousness toward animal suffering, the apprentices were allowed to watch human medical procedures. They would watch as conscious patients underwent trepanation, amputation, and organ manipulation, and they were expected to remain completely emotionally neutral. Any display of sympathy or disgust would lead to them being immediately kicked out of the training program, the most advanced stages of healer. Training involved directly participating in patient deaths. Apprentices were required to give fatal doses of toxic substances or perform procedures known to be lethal, supposedly as acts of mercy or religious sacrifice. These ritual killings served to involve the trainees in the system of medical violence while removing any remaining traces of normal human compassion. By the time an apprentice completed this psychological conditioning and became a full healer, they had been turned into something that was barely human. They could watch a patient die in agony from their actions and feel nothing but professional satisfaction at having performed the ritual correctly. They could drill holes in functional skulls or amputate healthy limbs without feeling any emotional response to the suffering they were causing. The social systems that supported these psychologically damaged healers ensured that their callousness would be celebrated rather than questioned. Viking communities praised healers who could perform the most difficult and painful procedures without hesitation, seeing their emotional detachment as proof of spiritual strength and professional competence. This created a horrifying loop where the most psychologically damaged healers got the most respect and the highest fees, while practitioners who kept any trace of normal human empathy were seen as weak and ineffective. The entire social structure of Viking medicine was designed to reward psychopathy and to punish any remaining traces of human compassion. The religious frameworks that justified Viking medical practices were carefully built to make questioning or criticism almost impossible. Healers claimed direct communication with the gods and presented their medical decisions as divine commands that couldn't be challenged without risking supernatural punishment. This religious authority was used to silence anyone who might ask why so many patients died during treatment or why the treatments themselves seemed to cause more suffering than the original injuries. Family members who expressed doubts about a healer's methods would be accused of lacking faith or having evil spirits, while patients who survived would be told their recovery was proof of the healer's spiritual power. The most sneaky part of this religious manipulation was how it was used to justify increasingly extreme procedures. If a simple treatment failed, healers would claim the gods demanded more elaborate rituals and more intense interventions. This created an escalating cycle where each failure was used to justify even more dangerous procedures, with the patient's suffering being seen as evidence that the spirits required a greater sacrifice. The financial exploitation that surrounded these religious medical practices was incredibly cynical. Healers would demand payment not just for their services, but for the ritual objects, sacrificial animals, and ceremonies needed for a successful treatment. Families facing medical emergencies would be told their loved one's life depended on their willingness to pay whatever was demanded, regardless of whether they could afford it. The most dishonest healers created elaborate schemes to get the most money from desperate families. They might claim a patient's condition required rare and expensive imported materials, or that the gods demanded specific types of sacrificial animals that could only be obtained at great cost. By the time the patient died, which was almost inevitable, the family was often completely broke. The documentation systems used by Viking healers were designed to hide, rather than reveal, the true nature of their practices. Instead of keeping records of patient outcomes or treatment effectiveness, healers maintained elaborate accounts of ritual compliance and spiritual importance that made it impossible to evaluate their actual medical performance. These records focused obsessively on details like the correct arrangement of ceremonial objects, the right pronunciation of chants, and the proper timing of procedures based on astronomical events. Meanwhile, important information like patient survival rates, complications, and outcomes was either completely ignored or buried under layers of mystical interpretation. This documentation system protected healers from criticism by making it impossible to prove their treatments were ineffective or harmful. Any attempt to evaluate the outcomes could be dismissed as focusing on unimportant physical concerns while ignoring the more important spiritual aspects of healing. The training materials passed down from master healers to their apprentices were masterpieces of misdirection, teaching complex ritual procedures but providing almost no useful medical knowledge. These texts were full of elaborate descriptions of ceremonial preparations but contained almost no practical information about human anatomy, disease, or effective treatments. Apprentice healers would spend years memorizing these rituals, learning to perform complex ceremonies perfectly while remaining completely ignorant of basic medical principles. They would finish their training with detailed knowledge of how to conduct elaborate healing rituals, but with no understanding of whether these rituals actually helped patients or just provided theatrical entertainment while people died. Competition between different Viking healers created more pressure that pushed medicine toward even greater levels of brutality and spectacle. Healers competed to develop the most impressive and elaborate procedures, not because they were more effective, but because they attracted more attention and higher fees. This professional rivalry led to an arms race of medical horror where healers constantly tried to one-up each other with increasingly complex and dangerous innovations. A healer who performed simple trepanation might be outdone by a competitor who claimed they could transplant organs or perform multiple surgeries at once. Regardless of whether these advanced procedures actually had better outcomes, the pressure to innovate and impress led some healers to experiment with procedures so bizarre and dangerous they defied all logic. Archaeological evidence suggests some practitioners tried to perform brain surgery with heated metals, transplant limbs between different patients, or treat internal injuries by intentionally introducing infections meant to fight the original disease. These experimental procedures were often presented as ancient techniques revealed by divine inspiration, giving them an authority that made it difficult for anyone to question their legitimacy. Patients and families were told they were receiving treatments so advanced and sacred that only the most skilled healers could perform them. The seasonal cycles of Viking medicine created more opportunities for exploitation and abuse as healers learned to manipulate the timing of treatments to maximize their profits and minimize their accountability. Certain procedures would be declared appropriate only during specific times of the year, forcing patients to wait for months while their conditions worsened. During these waiting periods, healers would often prescribe expensive preparatory treatments, supposedly needed to prepare the patient's body and spirit for surgery. These preliminary procedures might include dietary restrictions that left patients weak and malnourished, ritual scarring that created more wounds and infection risks, or drinking toxic substances said to have purifying effects. By the time the patient was finally ready for the main procedure, they were often in worse shape than when they first sought treatment. The months of preparatory abuse would have weakened their immune systems and lowered their chances of surviving the surgery. But the healers would blame any bad outcomes on the patients. Failure to prepare spiritually taught the international networks that connected Viking healers with practitioners from other cultures, created opportunities for the development of hybrid procedures that were more dangerous than any single medical tradition. When Viking healers encountered foreign medical techniques, they would often misunderstand the basic principles, focusing instead on the most dramatic and impressive parts of what they saw. This led to the creation of fusion procedures that combined Viking brutality with foreign complexity, resulting in treatments that were guaranteed to fail in spectacular and painful ways. A Viking healer might watch a Byzantine surgeon perform a delicate eye operation and decide to copy it with Viking tools, creating a hybrid surgery that had all the risks of both traditions, but none of the benefits. These international medical exchanges also created opportunities for one-upmanship, where healers would claim to have learned secret techniques from far-off lands, regardless of whether they actually understood the procedures or had any training. To perform them safely, the preservation and transmission of medical knowledge in Viking society were hindered by the same ritualistic thinking that plagued their practices. Instead of focusing on practical information that could improve patient outcomes, Viking medical texts and oral traditions emphasized mystical aspects of healing that had little to do with effective treatment. This meant each generation of healers inherited not a growing body of medical knowledge, but a more and more elaborate collection of superstitions and dangerous practices passed down without any critical evaluation. Techniques that consistently killed patients were preserved with the same reverence as procedures that sometimes worked, because the focus was on maintaining tradition rather than improving outcomes. The result was a medical system that actually became more dangerous over time, as each generation added their own ideas and interpretations to an already deadly collection of procedures. Instead of learning from the failures of their predecessors, Viking healers saw past disasters as lessons that required them to perform the same procedures with even greater ritual precision. The gender dynamics within Viking medicine created more layers of horror that affected both men and women in different but equally devastating ways. Female healers often focused on women's health issues, but their understanding of female anatomy was so warped by cultural beliefs and superstitions that their treatments were often more harmful than helpful. Women seeking care for reproductive issues would often be subjected to procedures based on the belief that female organs were fundamentally different from and inferior to male anatomy. This led to treatments that involved intentional trauma to reproductive organs, inserting foreign objects into body cavities, and using harsh substances meant to purify or strengthen female tissues. Male patients faced their own unique horrors, especially when seeking treatment for genital injuries. Viking culture's emphasis on masculine strength and sexual power meant any injury to male genitalia was seen not just as a physical problem, but as a spiritual crisis that needed elaborate and often mutilating treatments designed to restore the patient's masculine essence. The tools used for these gender-specific procedures were among the most terrifying in the Viking medical arsenal. Archaeological evidence shows specialized instruments designed for internal exams and manipulations that would have caused incredible trauma and guaranteed serious infections. These tools were often used repeatedly on multiple patients without any cleaning or sterilization, spreading disease and contamination throughout entire communities. The training of healers who specialized in gender-specific medicine involved more psychological conditioning designed to overcome the normal human reluctance to inflict intimate violence on vulnerable patients. These specialists went through long apprenticeships that included practicing on animals, corpses, and eventually living patients, learning to perform procedures that required them to ignore both their own instincts and their patient's obvious suffering. The social pressures around gender-specific medical treatment created situations where patients felt forced to undergo dangerous procedures rather than face the shame of being seen as unwilling to endure what was needed. Women might agree to mutilating gynecological procedures because refusing would be seen as a sign of moral weakness, while men would agree to genital surgery rather than be seen as a coward. The religious justifications for these gender-specific treatments were especially cruel, as they were often presented as necessary for maintaining proper relationships with gender-specific gods, or for fulfilling cultural expectations about masculine and feminine roles. Patients would be told their medical problems were proof that they had failed to properly embody their gender roles, and that the treatments were necessary not just for physical healing but for spiritual redemption. The financial aspects of gender-specific medicine created more opportunities for exploitation, as healers could charge premium prices for treatments supposedly tailored to the unique spiritual and physical needs of men or women. These specialized procedures were often more expensive than general treatments, but they were also more likely to result in complications and death because they involved intimate manipulations of delicate and vulnerable body parts. The long-term consequences of surviving Viking medical treatment were often worse than death. Patients who lived through the initial procedures frequently suffered from chronic pain, permanent disabilities, and ongoing infections that would plague them for the rest of their lives. The crude surgical techniques and contaminated instruments used by Viking healers guaranteed that any invasive procedure would result in lasting damage. Even if the patient survived the immediate trauma, survivors of trepanation often had chronic headaches, seizures, and cognitive problems that made it hard for them to function normally. The holes drilled in their skulls were permanent entry points for infections, and many patients suffered from recurring illnesses directly related to their surgery. Amputation survivors had even worse futures, as the crude cutting and cauterization techniques left them with stumps that were prone to infection and chronic pain. The lack of proper wound care meant these surgical sites rarely healed completely, leaving patients with open wounds that would leak and fester for months or years. After their operations, the psychological trauma experienced by medical survivors was perhaps even more devastating than their physical injuries. Patients who endured hours of excruciating pain during conscious surgery often developed what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, having nightmares, panic attacks, and an inability to function in social situations. These psychological wounds were made worse by the social stigma that often came with being a medical survivor, as their visible scars and disabilities served as permanent reminders of their encounters with the healing arts. Instead of being celebrated for their survival, These patients were often seen as examples of divine disapproval or spiritual weakness, adding social isolation to their physical and psychological suffering. The families of medical patients, whether they survived or died, were also traumatized. Parents who watched their children go through brutal surgeries carried emotional scars that affected their relationships with their other family members, while spouses and siblings struggled to cope with the memories of witnessing medical violence against their loved ones. The combined effect of these individual traumas was the creation of entire communities psychologically damaged by their exposure to medical horror. Viking society became more accepting of violence and suffering as a normal part of life, partly because so many people had been conditioned to see extreme pain as an acceptable price for supposed medical benefits. This cultural normalization of medical violence had lasting effects that went far beyond the direct victims. Children who grew up seeing these medical horrors developed warped ideas of human value and acceptable behavior, while adults who participated in or watched medical procedures became more callous toward human suffering in general. The archaeological evidence for the long-term consequences of Viking medical practice is both extensive and disturbing. Burial sites throughout Scandinavia contain the remains of individuals who clearly survived surgical procedures but lived with the results for years or decades afterward. These skeletal remains show signs of chronic infections, poorly healed bones, and progressive deterioration that can be directly linked to the medical interventions. Some of the most disturbing finds are the remains of people who had multiple surgeries throughout their lives, suggesting that surviving one intervention often led to more procedures to address the complications caused by the first surgery. These patients were trapped in a cycle of medical violence that continued until they finally died from the damage inflicted by their healers. The tools and instruments found in these burial sites tell their own horrifying stories, with many surgical implements showing signs of repeated use and poor maintenance that would have made them increasingly dangerous over time. Some tools show modifications and repairs that suggest they were used far beyond their safe lifespan, while others seem to have been intentionally altered in ways that would have made them more likely to cause tissue damage. The locations of these archaeological finds suggest that Viking medical practices were not limited to major cities or wealthy communities, but were widespread throughout Scandinavian society. Even small rural settlements show signs of surgical activity, indicating that the horrors of Viking medicine affected people at every level of society and in every corner of the Viking world. The preservation of organic materials and some archaeological sites has given us even more disturbing evidence, including textiles that seem to have been used for medical procedures and shows stains consistent with repeated exposure to blood and other body fluids. These materials suggest that Viking procedures were often performed in unsanitary conditions that maximize the risk of infection and cross-contamination. The spread of Viking medical practices through trade and conquest created a legacy of medical horror that went far beyond Scandinavia. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements in Ireland, England, France, and other regions shows clear signs of surgical activity that followed Viking patterns, indicating these dangerous practices were exported, along with other parts of Viking culture. The most disturbing part of this evidence is how it shows the persistence and continuity of these medical practices over time. Instead of improving or evolving in response to their obvious failures, Viking medical techniques stayed remarkably consistent across centuries and regions, suggesting that practitioners were either unable or unwilling to learn from their repeated disasters. The human cost of Viking medicine, as shown through archaeological and historical evidence, is one of the most systematic and prolonged periods of medical violence in human history. The combination of ignorance, superstition, financial exploitation, and psychological manipulation created a perfect storm of suffering that affected thousands of people across centuries and huge geographic regions. What makes this medical disaster even more tragic is how preventable much of the suffering was. Many of the conditions Viking healers tried to treat would have gone away on their own with simple rest and basic wound care, while others could have been effectively managed with herbal remedies and other traditional treatments already known to Viking society. Instead, patients who might have fully recovered with minimal intervention were subjected to procedures that guaranteed their death or permanent disability. The Viking medical system turned treatable injuries and illnesses into fatal catastrophes, creating suffering where none was necessary and death where life was possible. The legacy of Viking medicine is a powerful reminder of how medical systems can be corrupted by non-medical factors like profit, power, and superstition. When healing is made secondary to other agendas, the result is inevitably the creation of systems that harm rather than help, that exploit rather than serve, and that create suffering rather than relieve it. The lessons of Viking medical practice are still relevant today, as they show how easily medical systems can be corrupted when they lose sight of their basic purpose: the relief of human suffering and the preservation of human life. The Vikings created a medical system that served every purpose except the one that mattered most, and the result was centuries of unnecessary agony inflicted on people who deserved compassion and care, not exploitation and abuse. But perhaps the most chilling part of this medical nightmare was how it was justified and continued through elaborate social control systems that made resistance almost impossible. Viking communities developed complex hierarchies of medical authority that put healers at the top of a power pyramid that went down through apprentices, assistants, and finally to the patients themselves, who were at the bottom of this brutal social order. This structure ensured that questioning medical authority wasn't just discouraged, but actively punished as a form of social rebellion that threatened the community's relationship with the supernatural forces that supposedly controlled health and disease. Patients who had doubts about their treatment could be accused of lacking faith or having evil spirits, while family members who questioned a healer's methods might be shunned or even accused of witchcraft. The most insidious part of this social control was how it turned patients and their families into willing participants in their own destruction. People with serious injuries or illnesses were told that their recovery depended not just on agreeing to whatever procedures the healer prescribed, but on having complete faith in the healer's wisdom and divine connection throughout the entire ordeal. This meant patients had to suppress their natural instincts for self-preservation and actively cooperate in procedures their bodies were desperately trying to fight. They had to stay conscious and cooperative while experiencing levels of pain that would normally make people fight, run away, or pass out, all while being told that any failure to maintain a proper spiritual attitude could dim their chances of survival. The psychological manipulation involved in getting this level of patient compliance was incredibly sophisticated for a supposedly primitive society. Healers understood that people facing life-threatening emergencies were especially vulnerable to suggestion and authority, and they exploited this vulnerability with techniques that would make modern cult leaders jealous. Patients would be isolated from their normal support systems and surrounded by people who reinforced the healer's authority and the need for complete submission. They would be subjected to sleep deprivation, dietary restrictions, and sensory manipulation that left them disoriented and dependent on their healers for basic information about their own condition. The most effective psychological control technique was the use of partial successes and near misses to maintain hope and compliance, even when treatments were obviously failing. If a patient survived the first part of a procedure, This was presented as proof that the treatment was working and that continued cooperation was essential for a full recovery. If complications arose, they were blamed on the patient's lack of faith or hidden spiritual contamination rather than on flaws in the treatment itself. This created a psychological trap where patients became more and more invested in their own suffering, believing they had to endure whatever additional procedures were prescribed to avoid wasting the pain they had already gone through. The more they suffered, the more committed they became to seeing the process through to whatever end their healers deemed appropriate. The community reinforcement systems that supported these individuals' psychological manipulations were just as sophisticated and even harder to resist. Viking society developed elaborate rituals and ceremonies around medical treatment that turned individual suffering into community spectacles that strengthened social bonds while normalizing extreme violence against vulnerable people. When someone needed major medical treatment, it became a social event that brought together extended families, neighbors, and community leaders to watch and participate. These gatherings served multiple social functions beyond the supposed medical benefits, creating opportunities for political networking, religious observance, and entertainment that gave everyone a reason to support the system that made such events possible. The social pressure created by these community medical events was huge and almost impossible for individuals or families to resist. Refusing to participate in a community-sanctioned medical procedure would be seen as a rejection of social bonds and community values, which could result in permanent shunning or even exile. Children who grew up attending these medical spectacles learned to associate extreme human suffering with positive social experiences like family gatherings, religious celebrations, and community bonding. This psychological conditioning made it hard for them to recognize medical abuse when they encountered it as adults, because their earliest memories connected such experiences with love, belonging, and social approval. The economic systems that supported Viking medicine were designed to create financial dependencies that made it hard for communities to abandon dangerous practitioners, even when their incompetence was obvious. Healers usually required payment not just for their direct services, but for the materials, assistance, and facilities needed for effective treatment. This meant communities had to invest a lot of resources into maintaining a medical infrastructure designed specifically to support Viking healing practices. Once these investments were made, abandoning the system would mean losing significant community resources, creating powerful financial reasons to keep using dangerous medical services rather than admitting the whole system was flawed. The most successful healers learned to create more financial dependencies by training local assistants and apprentices who would have no other way to support themselves if the medical system changed. These secondary practitioners became strong supporters of traditional medical practices, not because they believed they were effective, but because their own financial survival depended on the continuation of the system that employed them. Healers also created financial relationships with suppliers of medical materials, ritual objects, and sacrificial animals, giving these merchants a financial interest in promoting the continued demand for elaborate medical procedures. This created networks of economic stakeholders who would actively oppose any changes to medical practice that might reduce demand for their products and services. The religious integration of Viking medicine created perhaps the most powerful barriers to reform or improvement, as medical procedures became tied to core spiritual beliefs that defined Viking cultural identity. Questioning medical practices meant questioning religious doctrine, which in turn meant challenging the fundamental worldview that held Viking society together. This religious integration was so thorough that many Viking communities literally couldn't imagine alternative medical treatments without abandoning their entire spiritual and cultural framework. Medical procedures weren't just practical interventions, they were sacred rituals that maintained the community's relationship with the supernatural forces that governed all aspects of life. The most sophisticated part of this religious integration was how it made medical failure part of the theological framework in a way that actually strengthened faith in the system. When patients died during treatment, it wasn't seen as proof that the procedures were flawed, but as proof that the spiritual forces were too powerful and complex for ordinary humans to fully understand. Each medical disaster became a chance for deeper religious thought and more elaborate spiritual preparation for future interventions. Instead of leading to skepticism, treatment failures led to more investment in the religious aspects of healing, creating cycles of escalating spiritual complexity that made the medical system even more dangerous and expensive over time. The geographic spread of Viking medical practices created more barriers to reform by establishing these dangerous techniques over such a wide area that no single community could abandon them without becoming isolated from the broader cultural network that defined Viking identity. Communities that tried to develop alternative methods would find themselves cut off from trade, marriage alliances, and political connections essential for survival. This geographic entrenchment meant that Viking practices became self-perpetuating across entire regions, with each community reinforcing the other's commitment to traditional methods, regardless of their obvious failures. The system became too big and too spread out to fail, even though it was failing individual patients constantly. The most tragic part of this geographic spread was how it prevented the kind of local experimentation and innovation that might have led to real medical improvements. Communities that might have been willing to try alternative approaches were prevented from doing so by the need to stay compatible with the practices of their neighbors and trading partners. This created a situation where the worst parts of Viking medicine were preserved and passed on over vast distances and long periods, while any potentially beneficial innovations were suppressed because they didn't fit within the established framework of acceptable medical practice. The documentation systems used by Viking medical practitioners were designed specifically to prevent the kind of critical evaluation that might have led to better patient care. Instead of keeping records that would allow for systematic comparison of treatment outcomes, Viking healers kept elaborate accounts of ritual compliance and spiritual importance that hid, rather than showed, the actual effectiveness of their interventions. These documentation practices served multiple functions beyond simple record keeping. They provided legal protection for healers by creating official accounts that emphasized the proper performance of established procedures while downplaying or ignoring negative outcomes. They also served as training materials for apprentices, teaching them to focus on ritual precision rather than patient well-being. Most importantly, these documentation systems created the appearance of scientific rigor and systematic knowledge while actually preventing the collection of useful medical information. The elaborate detail about ceremonial aspects of treatment created an impression of advanced practice that helped maintain public confidence in the system while hiding its fundamental incompetence. The preservation of these medical records over centuries has given modern researchers detailed information about Viking healing rituals, but almost no useful data about patient outcomes or effectiveness. This documentation strategy was so successful that it has continued to mislead scholars about the nature of Viking medicine, with some researchers interpreting the elaborate ceremonial descriptions as evidence of advanced medical knowledge rather than recognizing them as sophisticated systems for professional protection and public deception. The training systems used to educate Viking medical practitioners were perhaps the most evil part of the whole system, as they were specifically designed to produce healers who were psychologically incapable of recognizing or responding to patient suffering properly. These programs didn't just fail to teach effective techniques, they actively destroyed the normal human empathy and critical thinking, skills that might have led practitioners to question or improve their methods. The systematic destruction of empathy began in early childhood and continued throughout the entire education process, using techniques designed to break down normal emotional responses to pain and death. Young apprentices were exposed to increasingly disturbing scenarios in carefully controlled steps that gradually made them numb to human suffering while reinforcing their dependence on authority figures for guidance. By the time these apprentices became full practitioners, they had been transformed into individuals who could inflict tremendous pain and witness horrific suffering without feeling any of the emotional distress that would normally motivate people to seek better alternatives. They had been trained to see patient screams as proof that treatment was working and to see deaths as proof that spiritual forces were too powerful for medicine to overcome. The most insidious part of this training system was how it created practitioners who were genuinely convinced they were providing beneficial care. These healers weren't cynical charlatans who knew they were causing harm. They were true believers who had been conditioned to see evidence of treatment failure as confirmation that their methods were correct and that they needed to apply them with even greater intensity. This psychological conditioning was so thorough that it created healers who were literally unable to learn from experience in any meaningful way. They could watch death and disability happen again and again, but their training prevented them from seeing these outcomes as proof that their methods were flawed. Instead, each failure reinforced their belief that the spiritual forces of healing were complex and powerful, requiring even greater skill and dedication to master. The social dynamics around Viking medical training ensured that this system of psychological conditioning would be preserved and passed down for generations without change. Communities invested a lot of resources in training practitioners and had strong reasons to believe these investments were producing competent healers, rather than admitting they were creating dangerous sociopaths. The apprenticeship system also created powerful emotional bonds between masters and their students that made it almost impossible for apprentices to question their teachers' methods. Students who had spent years learning complex procedures and rituals had a huge psychological investment in believing their education was valuable and their masters were wise. The competition between different healing traditions and schools created more pressure that pushed training toward even greater brutality and complexity. Programs competed to produce healers who could perform the most impressive and elaborate procedures, leading to an escalation of dangerous techniques that prioritized dramatic impact over patient well-being. The international aspects of Viking medical training created opportunities for even greater horrors, as different traditions were combined and changed in ways that produced hybrid systems that were more destructive than any single approach. When Viking training methods met foreign medical education systems, the result was typically the adoption of the most dangerous and authoritarian parts of each tradition, while leaving out any beneficial parts that might have promoted critical thinking or patient-focused care. The lasting systems that came from Viking medical training still influence medical education in subtle but important ways today. The emphasis on ritual precision over measuring outcomes, the prioritization of professional authority over patient well-being, and the systematic suppression of empathy for clinical detachment can all be traced back to the psychological conditioning techniques developed by Viking medical trainers. Understanding these historical connections is crucial for recognizing and dealing with similar problems in modern medical systems, where the same tensions between professional authority and patient well-being continue to create opportunities for systematic abuse and neglect. The Viking experience shows how easily medical training can be corrupted when it loses sight of its main purpose and starts focusing on maintaining professional hierarchies rather than developing genuine healing skills. The financial exploitation of Viking medicine was so sophisticated, it rivals the most cynical modern insurance scams, with healers creating elaborate schemes to get the most money from desperate families, while providing services that were guaranteed to fail. These economic systems were so effective that they created sustainable business models based entirely on human suffering and medical incompetence. The most successful Viking healers knew their income depended not on helping patients get better, but on appearing to provide valuable services while creating dependencies that would generate continuous revenue. They learned to diagnose conditions that required long treatment plans, to prescribe procedures that would create complications needing more interventions, and to structure their services in a way that maximized payment while minimizing their own legal and social risks. The pricing strategies of these medical entrepreneurs were especially cruel, designed to exploit the emotional vulnerability of families in medical emergencies. Healers would often provide initial consultations for a low cost, using these sessions to find families with a lot of money that could be taken through escalating treatment demands. Once a family was committed to a treatment plan, healers would slowly increase their demands for payment, claiming the patient's condition was more serious than first thought, or that the spiritual forces needed more expensive interventions. By the time families realized they were being exploited, they had already invested so much that stopping would mean losing everything they had already paid. The most sophisticated healers created elaborate schemes for treatments that lasted months or years, creating ongoing income streams that could support luxurious lifestyles while giving families just enough hope to prevent them from seeking other care. These long treatment plans typically involved cycles of seeming improvement, followed by dramatic setbacks that required emergency interventions, creating emotional roller coasters that kept families psychologically invested in continuing to pay for services. The financing for these extended treatments was especially predatory, with healers offering credit that trapped families in debt that could last for generations. Families who couldn't pay for expensive procedures right away were offered a chance to pay over time, with interest rates and penalties that guaranteed they would never be able to finish their payments. These debt relationships created more forms of social control that made it even harder for families to question or abandon dangerous treatments. Families who owed money to healers were vulnerable to public shame and legal action if they didn't continue paying, while healers could use the threat of debt collection to silence criticism and stop negative stories from reaching other potential patients. The insurance and risk-sharing systems that developed around Viking medicine also created more opportunities for exploitation, with healers creating schemes that socialized the costs of treatment while privatizing the profits. Communities were encouraged to contribute to a collective fund for medical care, but these funds were usually controlled by healers who could manipulate them for their own benefit. The accounting and auditing systems used to manage these funds were intentionally confusing, making it impossible for community members to know if their contributions were being used properly or if the services were actually worth the cost. Healers who controlled these funds could take resources for themselves while claiming that high costs were necessary to maintain the spiritual purity and professional competence needed for effective healing. The marketing and advertising techniques used by Viking healers were surprisingly sophisticated for their time, involving elaborate public relations campaigns that highlighted dramatic successes while hiding systematic failures. Healers knew their success depended on public confidence and developed comprehensive strategies for managing their public image regardless of their actual performance. The most effective marketing was the strategic use of testimonials from satisfied customers. Healers would carefully select and promote cases where patients had a good outcome, while hiding information about the much larger number of cases that resulted in death or disability. These testimonials were often exaggerated or completely made up, creating a false impression of competence that attracted new patients while hiding the real risks of treatment. Healers also learned to exploit the human tendency to remember dramatic events more vividly than routine ones, staging elaborate public ceremonies around their rare successes while making sure their many failures happened in private, where they were less likely to be remembered or talked about. This created systematic distortions in public perception that made dangerous healers seem more competent than they actually were. The professional networks that connected Viking healers created more opportunities for market manipulation, with groups of practitioners working together to keep prices artificially high while suppressing competition from other healing methods. These professional associations would set standard fee schedules, divide up geographic areas, and coordinate marketing efforts to maximize their collective profits while limiting patient choice. The most sophisticated part of these networks was how they used their collective influence to shape legal and regulatory frameworks to protect their own interests, while making it hard for patients to seek compensation for medical injuries. Healers would use their relationships with political and religious leaders to ensure that medical malpractice was difficult to prove and that successful practitioners were protected from criticism or legal action. The international trade networks of Viking communities created more opportunities for medical fraud, with healers claiming access to exotic treatments and rare materials that cost a lot of money but provided no medical benefit. These international connections allowed healers to create an artificial scarcity around common materials, claiming their treatments were based on advanced foreign knowledge that justified extraordinary fees. The most cynical healers would import worthless substances from distant lands and present them as powerful medicines that were worth huge sums, while also claiming that the rarity and expense of these materials proved their effectiveness. Patients and families who paid these inflated prices were actually paying for elaborate lies that provided no medical benefit while enriching healers who had no real expertise or foreign connections. The technological innovations that came from Viking medicine were typically focused on making procedures more impressive and profitable rather than more effective or less dangerous. Healers developed increasingly elaborate instruments and techniques that served mainly as marketing tools rather than real medical improvements. These developments created the appearance of medical progress while actually making treatments more dangerous and expensive. The most sophisticated medical instruments were often the most dangerous, as they were designed for complex procedures their operators didn't truly understand and that patients' bodies couldn't survive. Healers would invest a lot of money in acquiring and maintaining these impressive-looking tools, then use their ownership of advanced equipment to justify charging higher fees while providing treatments that were more likely to kill patients than simpler alternatives. The research and development that produced these innovations focused entirely on creating dramatic visual and psychological effects rather than improving patient outcomes. Healers collaborated to develop procedures that would impress audiences and justify premium pricing while ignoring any thoughts of safety or effectiveness. This created systematic incentives for medical innovation that prioritized spectacle over substance and profit over patient well-being. The quality, control, and safety monitoring systems that were supposed to ensure the competence of Viking practitioners were actually elaborate shams that legitimized dangerous practices while providing no real protection for patients. These regulatory frameworks were typically controlled by the same healers whose practices they were supposed to be overseeing, creating conflicts of interest that guaranteed dangerous practitioners would be protected, not disciplined. The certification and licensing systems that decided who could practice medicine were designed to maintain professional monopolies rather than ensure competence. with established healers using regulations to exclude potential competitors while protecting their own members no matter their actual performance. These professional gatekeeping systems created an artificial shortage of medical services, allowing incompetent practitioners to charge high prices while facing no real competition, the peer review and professional oversight that were supposed to maintain medical standards were actually systems of mutual protection that ensured dangerous practitioners would be shielded from criticism and accountability. Healers understood that their shared interests were best served by protecting each other from outside scrutiny, regardless of how many patients were harmed by incompetent or fraudulent practices. The documentation and record-keeping requirements imposed on practitioners were designed to create the appearance of systematic oversight while actually providing legal protection for healers who followed established protocols no matter the outcomes. These documentation systems focused on showing compliance with ritual requirements rather than tracking patient well-being, creating comprehensive records that hid rather than revealed the true extent of medical incompetence and abuse. The continued influence of Viking medical practices on modern healthcare systems is one of the most disturbing parts of this entire historical episode. Many of the fundamental problems of Viking medicine still affect modern systems in subtle but important ways. The prioritization of professional authority over patient well-being, the emphasis on impressive procedures over effective treatments, and the systematic exploitation of patient vulnerability for financial gain all have clear parallels in contemporary medicine. Understanding the historical roots of these problems is essential for recognizing and addressing them in modern contexts where the same fundamental tensions between healing and profit continue to create opportunities for systematic abuse and neglect. The Viking experience shows how easily medical systems can be corrupted when they lose sight of their basic purpose and how hard it can be to reform systems that have become ingrained through economic, social, and psychological mechanisms that serve the interests of practitioners rather than patients. The lessons of Viking medicine are still relevant today, serving as a warning about the dangers of letting medical systems be controlled by things other than the relief of human suffering and the preservation of human life. When healing is made secondary to profit, power, or professional prestige, the result is inevitably the creation of systems that harm rather than help, that exploit rather than serve, and that continue suffering rather than alleviate it.